DW Africa Link.
South Africa is yet again celebrating another Mandela Day. The man who dreamed of a country where dignity was non-negotiable, where neighbors, whether across the streets or across a border, stood together in shared humanity. But today, that humanity is being questioned in anti-foreigner protest. Thousands of African migrants are packing their lives into bags and leaving the Rainbow Nation amid fear, anger, and violence. The key question being asked is, has South Africa betrayed the legacy of the man who gave his life to build it? That's what we are discussing today. This is Africa Link, the podcast that connects you to the stories that matter across Africa. I am Adwoa Tenkoramaa Domena, your host for today.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
South Africa marks Mandela Day on the 18th of July every year to shine light on the legacy of a man who changed the 20th century and helped shape the 21st century. The theme for the 2026 celebration is "It's still in our hands to combat poverty and inequity." The South African government says this moment is for the country to act and restore itself. Nelson Mandela, in addressing the scourge of poverty, suffering, and deprivation, said, "It is in your hands to make our world a better one for all, especially the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized." But today, what is the reality? Unemployment is soaring, inequality is deepening, but the spirit of Ubuntu feels dangerously thin. To help us discuss this year's Mandela Day, I'm joined by Sebenzile Nkambule. She's a media and development practitioner, and DW's Thuso Khumalo from Johannesburg. Gentlemen and lady, thank you and welcome to the program. Sebenzile, my first question is to you. If Nelson Mandela was alive today, what would he say about the current South Africa?
It's a tough question to start with because, we have to look at present day South Africa within the context of our history, a very difficult and a painful history, right from colonialism to apartheid, and then having to try and really build a new country and only having, what are we now, 32 years old as a country, 32 years to try and figure it out. And I think any objective assessment of what's happening in the country will indeed show an appreciation for the many challenges that exist in the country. I think what I'm interested in particular about Mandela's legacy is at least what we know about his public life is a consistent thread, right, in his values and the ideals that he stood for, which I think is the value of courage. He had, along with his comrades, struggle heroes, many that we celebrate and many that we don't. The decision now in post-apartheid South Africa after our first elections, or even I suppose prior to that, because it was all a negotiation, was to also once again make a courageous choice, which did upset a lot of people. Not everybody bought into it, to say, let's choose the path of reconciliation. Let's choose the path of building a country, a just country where people are not discriminated based on race, based on gender, on sex, on a range of other identifiers, and actually try and build together. And so you have a freedom charter, right, which also talks about South Africa being a place or a country that belongs to all who then live with it. And then they take on the journey then of trying to establish a country anew from electoral systems and processes, trying to get people who've been discriminated against or left out of democratic participation to participate, to have a say. People who never saw a ballot paper in their lives, for example, had to be taught how this works. You had to bring in people into formal education. You had to also fight against think about the apartheid government, or those in fact who did not want change, pushing back against transformation and still wanting to hang on to the economy and hang on to power and so on. But we took on a lot of issues at once. And what is happening today is that you are beginning to see the cracks. In fact, they didn't start today, but this is just a symptom of the cracks where a lot of people feel even 30 years later, they've been left behind, have been asked to accommodate a lot of things which have left them behind. And they are now saying they are tired. But what is unfortunate, though, is that the anger and the frustration is not always pointed to the right direction, which is the leadership of the country and of the continent. But sadly, it's being taken to or directed towards also other vulnerable people. So I think it would be a very heartbreaking assessment of where we are. But the point I really want to get across is we cannot look at the events of present-day South Africa in isolation. It's all connected to where we come from and the ills of the past.
All right. So I'm very excited that you have mentioned the post-apartheid identity of South Africa. And one key point you also mentioned was the fact that South Africa belongs to all who lived in it. I mean, we can talk about the contributions of all other African countries. And for some reason, when we are talking about the current migration crisis that South Africa is facing, you hear some Africans say that we helped you build your country. We helped you when you were dealing with this. We helped you do this. So why is South Africa turning its back on its own people? I mean, it's a rainbow nation for a reason, no?
And it remains such. It remains that rainbow nation. Just to quickly say, migration is not unique to South Africa. We see it the world over. People will move and will continue to move. It's important that we understand why it is that people are moving away from their countries. What has really broken my heart in watching what has happened is that you see a lot of incidents of people coming from, I'll talk about Malawans because there's a lot happening now with them and the repatriation. They come in some of the conditions that they live in these dilapidated buildings in the inner city and so on. It's conditions that no human being should be subjected to, right? And the fact that they leave their homes and would rather live in conditions like that than go back home. That is an indictment on the leaders of that country, that the people would rather be subjected to such terrible conditions instead of being home. And I think it's important that as we call for accountability, that we call for it across the board. South Africa remains that rainbow nation, remains the aspirational, hopeful nation that was birthed in trenches, in camps, in communities here with people who didn't run away and or weren't forced to go to exile, for example, who were fighting and kept the embers burning, right? While political and struggle leaders were outside of the country. So it's a struggle that many people own, even though their names will never be known, right? Because they were not at the forefront of that. And believe in the ideals of being part of Africa and being part of the true and full and complete liberation of Africans on this continent. And so the challenges here are actually incredibly nuanced because, like I said, when people are subjecting themselves to difficult conditions, you wonder how bad the conditions that they're running away from home actually are. But we're also a country, like any other country, that is governed by the rule of law, right? And the law in this country also says that if you, in terms of how it recognizes you, if you were born here or your parents and so on, the type of documentation that we carry and so on, and the different categories of documentation that different people carry. Mind you, we also have a problem of South Africans themselves who do not have identity documents. People who were born here for whatever reason were not registered formally and so on. So people whose lives have been stalled because of this. But it is important that the rule of law is upheld. And this is what I think some of these groups, and even though I don't agree with their methods and how they're approaching it, but some of what they are raising is legitimate and valid. That if you do not know how many people are in the country, how do you plan, right? How do you plan for the kinds of the housing you need to build, the schools, the hospitals, the police that you need to have if you do not know how many people are actually here? And we know we have a crisis of people who come in, and aided by South African officials themselves at border entry points, letting people in who do not have the correct documentation or not having sufficient checks and balances to make sure that people are coming in and are stamped at borders or have the permits and so on to work or to operate businesses and so on. Imagine in your house yourself, if you're having to buy groceries and you don't know if you're buying food for 5 people or for 50 people, right? You actually cannot govern at that level.
Thuso, let me bring you in at this point. You have been on the ground for a while, covering the protests, covering the people who are actually migrants who are leaving South Africa. Do you think that the South Africans who are currently driving the anti-migrant movement, do you believe they think they are defending Mandela's legacy?
For many of these protesters, I think Sebenzile pointed it out that you have some with very negative energy when it comes to what Mandela did. Some of them will tell you we are in this messy because of him. What are they talking about? They are talking about things like that openness of Mandela, forgiveness of Mandela, embracing the rest of Africa. They are saying that was the mistake which brought them where they are now. When they look at the open borders, they blame that on him. Of course, it's the system, it's not Mandela as a person, but they are saying as the father of democracy here, they kind of point hands at him to say he's responsible for that. So you don't get from most of the protesters I've spoken to, when I talk about Mandela, his legacy, what he stood for, Ubuntu, they'll just tell you those things don't exist. It is the problem that has caused all the problems of South Africa. People coming here thinking they are South Africans because the constitution says all who live in it belongs to South Africa. So you get that negative energy about Mandela. So for them, they'll tell you we're fixing the mistakes of Mandela, we're fixing what Mandela and the ANC have done to us. We want even the constitution changed so that it reflects that it puts South Africans first, not everyone in one blanket. So you hear this argument more of Mandela messed this. Some of them even go to an extent of saying Mandela sold out because they believe even in the forgiveness, in making a rainbow nation, they believe they lost out. There could have been reparations or something from the apartheid people. So there's this notion of saying we are fixing what Mandela have messed up. But it's not all South Africans. There are some who still believe in the Ubuntu, even amongst the protesters, who are saying, of course, immigration laws must be implemented, but let's do it legally. Let's do it humanly. These are human beings. Let's send them back, but in a way that's humane. But you've got all the mixed feelings. So as far as that legacy of Mandela is concerned, some are saying we are correcting it, but some are saying let's stick to it, but still implement the immigration laws.
What about the government? What is the framing they have attached to this year's Mandela Day celebration? Is it, we have to rebuild South Africa for ourselves, or we have to admit that these are the challenges we are facing, but also we have to admit that there are people who helped us come this far? What really is the framing surrounding this year's celebration from the government?
I think from the government point of view, the government is straightforward and is consistent in saying we are Africans. South Africa is welcoming everyone coming from wherever, as long as they come into the country illegally. And they've also been, in the spirit of Mandela too, saying it's a rainbow nation, everyone is welcome, emphasizing, of course, that immigration laws must be observed. No one can just come willy-nilly in the country. So they've said that. Even when it comes to the violence that is meted on foreign nationals, they've cautioned citizens against that, to say it's against the law, they cannot do it, even violently evicting them. They've cautioned against that. But unfortunately, it has been more on what they are saying than what they are doing, because what we have seen on the ground, we have seen constantly this violence continue to happen in some marches, immigrants being beaten, sometimes assaulted in front of the police, sometimes documents being demanded from immigrants by civilians who are not mandated to do so, which is not what the law is saying. So in terms of what the government is saying, it is hitting on that we are one, we're Africa as one, we should be welcoming, following the laws. But in terms of trying to follow that, in terms of actions when it comes to violence that's being meted on immigrants, we haven't seen that much. The numbers that they've given us about people that have been arrested, the bulk of those numbers are illegal immigrants or undocumented migrants that have been arrested. Of course, there have been cases where some people have been looting or meeting some kind of violence have been arrested, but we don't see that being implemented in a way that deters other people from doing protests that are outside what the Constitution permits them to do.
Sebenzile, the theme for this year's Mandela Day is still in our hands to combat poverty and inequity. What does that mean for the ordinary South African today?
So I think what these protests, notwithstanding the unfortunate scenes and the indignity that Africans in particular have been subjected to, what I think it's reminded us of is this very idea of needing to stand up and not go to sleep, really, and relinquish our power as people to politicians, to a few who may proclaim to serve the interests of the people when in fact they may be letting people down. And I think this sort of mindset needs to permeate the entire continent, that what makes democracies powerful is that power rests with the people and not the other way around, where it rests in the hands of the few, and that it is the majority that must be in service of the few, as opposed to those who have the privilege to be given responsibility to run the country, that in fact they are the ones who should be serving people. So in a quite an ironic way, I think the resurgence of these protests, because it's not the first time we see them, has been a reminder about the vacuum that I think people had allowed to grow. We're a country that was built on protest, on struggle, on civic participation. And I think post 94, many people perhaps have set back a bit. Yeah, of course, the protests continue, right? People protesting over water on a weekly basis, access to electricity when we had the scourge of power outages, load shedding in the country. There were protests all the time. There are protests now as well about a range of issues. This issue of immigration is not the only or the most pressing issue. It's certainly getting the most attention right now, but there's a lot happening in the country. And I think it's important that not only just for South Africans, but for Africans, that we remember that we have to take ownership of our countries and the future of our countries. And if we sit back and relinquish that responsibility, you then allow nefarious actors, dodgy actors, external forces to come in and actually try and kill the potential of this continent before it is in fact realized. And so more voices, I hope, who will counter the narrative of indignity, the narrative of disunity, will actually rise up and take up that space and actually contribute towards strengthening our democracies, strengthening the rule of law, and forcing those in government to actually do their job, because we are here because too many people have absconded on their jobs, and this is why we are in the crisis that we find ourselves in. So I hope there's a shift in the atmosphere that actually awakens active citizenship across the continent.
But that's a bit tricky because when you talk about active citizenship, then the question is, where do you draw the lines from how much citizens are demanding, to, for instance, veering into intimidation, veering into chasing people out, veering into physical attacks on people, door to door, moving from houses to houses, chasing people out. That is a big question. And in fact, one of the key concerns people have raised in all these moments of migration concerns is the fact that it appears the citizens are setting the pace for the government. What do you think authorities should have done that they've not done, for which reason citizens feel the need to take the laws into their own hands?
Those incidents are straight up unequivocal cases of criminality. And the police must do their job and arrest South Africans who go door to door intimidating people. There's no debate about that. We have no right to do that. That's not what I am certainly advocating for. I'm advocating for people to, if there's an issue with service delivery, you protest, you write to your councillor, you write to the legislature, you do everything that the law of this country allows you to do as a citizen, to engage your public representatives, your parliamentarians, all these people who are in positions and have the responsibility to carry out work and have the responsibility to account to citizens, right? And there are a range of things that our law allows us to do. I can't comment on what can happen elsewhere on the continent, but in our country, we have a right to protest. And a lot of these marches, and there've been a range of reports, even from the Interministerial Committee, the police, after the 30th of June, they spoke about how the majority of the protests were peaceful, right? But of course, you have the elements outside of that engage in criminality, and those people must be dealt with through our criminal justice system. But in terms of what I mean by active participation is if there's an issue of water in your community, don't wait for other people to find out how to sort that out. Know what the law allows you to do and use those channels to take that on. If there's an issue of crime, go to the local police station, see what you can do. Don't sit back and let these issues fester and lose communities to criminals, to drugs, to gangs, the gang violence that we speak about in parts of Johannesburg and the Western Cape. Those require daily activity from communities so that we save our communities. That's what I mean. I'm definitely not advocating for people to go door to door and check people's papers. That is criminal behavior, and that must be addressed. But in terms of participating in what's happening in the country, in the community, we all need to get involved within the parameters of the law.
Very well, Sebenzile Nkambule, thank you so much for your time. She's a media and development practitioner, also a former journalist. You also heard DW's Thuso Khumalo joining us from Johannesburg. Grateful for your time, you both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Africa is changing. Don't get left behind. Tune in to Africa Link.
The 2026 Mandela Day has met South Africa at a crossroads. Mandela reminded the world that poverty and injustice are not natural, they are man-made and they can be undone by human action. The question now is whether South Africa, its leaders, communities, and institutions will choose that action, whether they will choose Ubuntu over anger, solidarity over scapegoating, and dignity over fear. Share your thoughts with us on Facebook and on TikTok at DW Africa. Listen to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to our DW Africa YouTube channel. This show was co-produced and edited by Isaac Mugabe. I am Adwoa Tenkoramaa Domena. Bye for now.
DW, made for mind.